Hi, this is Congressman Mike Doyle. Hi, this is Congressman.
Welcome to today's. I'm sorry, Chairman. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, Zach. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is Congressman Mike Doyle, and I'm pleased to welcome Chairman Pai of the FCC, as well as my friend and colleague, Ranking Member Bob Latta. Also want to welcome our Chairman Frank Pallone and Ranking Member Greg Walden of the full committee, and all the members of the subcommittee. This call is part of the Energy and Commerce Committee's ongoing oversight of our government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to remind all participants that this forum is open to the press and that a recording will be posted online. Given the extraordinary circumstances we face today, we are holding this forum over the phone as opposed to in a committee hearing room. Now more than ever, Americans are relying on the internet to communicate, to work, to learn, and to participate in society. For far too many, access and affordability remain out of reach. Millions of children are stuck in homes that lack broadband access, preventing them from doing schoolwork. Millions of Americans lack access, and millions still can't afford access. The shortfalls and inequities of our nation's broadband networks has been put in stark view by this crisis.
Hello?
Hello?
I'm here, Greg, but I don't hear anybody else.
No, I don't either. I got Bob.
I lost Mike.
It looks like we may have lost Chairman Doyle. Ranking Member Latta, would you like to go with your opening remarks?
Yeah. Well, I think we've got it a little glitchy right now, but I want to thank Chairman Doyle for today's call. I also want to thank Chairman Pallone and Leader Walden for being on this call. Also want to thank Chairman Pai for taking the time to update the subcommittee on the actions that have been taken by the Commission in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. By all indications, our networks have withstood the stress test that this crisis has presented them. While we know that some folks are still on the wrong side of the digital divide, those who have access to broadband have largely been able to continue working, learning, and receiving health care at home. This is a testament to the light touch regulatory framework in the United States that has encouraged investment and innovation. I also want to thank Chairman Pai for his leadership coordinating with communications companies to keep Americans connected. More than 750 broadband and telephone providers have signed the Keep Americans Connected pledge, committing not to terminate service for an inability to pay, waiving late fees, and open hotspots to any American who wants to use them. This has allowed for countless number of Americans to stay connected despite how the coronavirus has affected their lives. The Commission has also set up a program in warp speed to distribute the $200 million Congress appropriated for them in the CARES Act to promote telehealth services and connected devices. I really look forward to having this discussion today on this topic, and I really thank the Chairman for being with us, and I yield back.
Chairman Latta, this is Mike Doyle again. I'm sorry, I think my call got dropped off, but thank you for your remarks, and now I think we want to hear from Chairman Pai.
Well, thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate your organizing this briefing and giving me a chance to update you on the FCC's efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to recognize Chairman Pallone and Ranking Member Walden for their participation in this briefing. And it goes without saying, but I do hope that all of you and your families and your staffs are staying safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. Since becoming FCC Chairman in January of 2017, my priority has been to close the digital divide. And with the coronavirus pandemic, as Chairman Doyle advocated, internet connectivity is more important than ever. American consumers are relying on broadband to telework, to take classes online, to consult with doctors remotely, and stay in touch with loved ones who they can't see in person. And that's why on March 13th, which is 3 days before the White House issued its social distancing guidelines and 6 days before any state in the country issued a stay-at-home order, I called on America's broadband and telephone service providers to pledge that for 60 days, no consumer or small business would have service cut off or be charged late fees because of disruptions caused by the pandemic. I also challenged them to open up their Wi-Fi hotspots to any consumer who may need them. I call this the Keep Americans Connected pledge, and in a big win for the American people, more than 700 providers serving the vast majority of broadband and telephone subscribers answered this call. Now, based on the feedback we've received over the last several weeks, the pledge has been critical to maintaining connectivity for millions of Americans. And that's why on April 30th, I announced an extension of the pledge beyond the original 60-day commitment to June 30th. I'm pleased that we have even more companies, specifically 774 of them, who've committed to this extension beyond the initial pledge. In addition to the pledge, I also urge these providers to go above and beyond those commitments, and I'm grateful that many of them have done so. Many companies, large and small, have offered free or discounted service for low-income Americans and students. They've lifted or waived data caps, and they've increased broadband speeds at no cost to consumers to help meet the increased demand for telework and distance learning. Now, network usage from telework and distance learning, not to mention gaming and binge watching and the like, how are networks performing? And here I'm pleased to report to you that our networks in the United States are handling this surge in demand pretty well. One reason our networks have been able to handle the traffic increase is that we've seen significant increases in investments and improvements to our broadband infrastructure in recent years. Since 2016, for example, internet speeds are up over 80%. The percentage of homes with access to 250 megabit per second broadband has doubled, and we broke records for fiber deployment in each of the past 2 years. Indeed, all of the infrastructure deployment that we've seen over the last 3 years has been critical to keeping our country running during this pandemic. Moreover, since the pandemic began, the FCC has taken targeted actions to boost the performance of our wireless networks, and those decisions are paying dividends. For example, we quickly granted several wireless providers, STAs as they're called, special temporary authority, to use additional spectrum to meet customer demand for mobile broadband across the United States. And just last week, new independent data was released showing faster download speeds in April for carriers using the spectrum, even with big increases in traffic. Another big priority for the Commission has been our COVID-19 telehealth program. First, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, let me say thank you to the members of this subcommittee and your leadership and Congress generally for establishing this program as part of the CARES Act. The FCC quickly stood up this program, and we've already funded 82 healthcare providers in 30 states. In Pennsylvania, for example, we awarded funding to the UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh to provide telehealth services to children who have received organ transplants and are thus immunocompromised, putting them at high risk for COVID-19. By enabling remote health services, we increase the number of people who can access care while reducing the risk for patients and healthcare providers alike. We're still receiving and quickly processing applications, and I can tell you that this is a top Commission priority. We're also working hard to fulfill our consumer protection mission. Unfortunately, scammers are promoting bogus cures. They are offering fake test kits, sending hoax text messages, and generally preying on consumers' virus-related fears. And that's why the FCC is doing all it can to help consumers avoid these scams. Last month, together with the Federal Trade Commission, we successfully demanded that 3 gateway providers stop bringing COVID-19 related scam robocalls into the country, and they did so within 24 hours. We've also launched a COVID-19 consumer warnings and safety tips webpage to alert consumers to pandemic-related scam phone calls and texts. The last thing I'd like to mention to all of you is that even though the Commission shifted to mandatory telework in early March, we've continued to operate very smoothly, and this is a tribute to our talented and dedicated staff that continues to prove every day that they are the agency's greatest asset. In addition to all of our work to address the COVID-19 pandemic, we've also continued to move forward on long-standing initiatives like opening up the 6 gigahertz band to unlicensed operation for Wi-Fi for consumers, and thus increasing the amount of mid-band spectrum available for Wi-Fi by a factor of 5. I'm profoundly grateful to our staff, great public servants, for their ability to get all of this work done in the face of numerous challenges, including childcare and worrying about older relatives, and just general stress from the disruption to our daily lives that all of them have been facing during this time. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for the opportunity to be with the subcommittee. We look forward to answering your questions and to continuing to work with you to meet the connectivity needs of the American people during this challenging period in our nation's history. And thank you, Mr. Chairman and Zach.
I will now recognize Chairman Doyle for a question. Chairman Doyle, your line is live.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it. I'm concerned about all the folks around the country and in my district that have been laid off or furloughed as a result of this pandemic, as well as those households that lack broadband access in the first place. I understand the FCC has relaxed some of its rules around qualifying and staying on the Lifeline program, which largely provides smartphone connectivity to low-income Americans. But we need to do more, and that's why House Democrats included strong emergency broadband benefits provisions based on Mr. Vesey's legislation in the HEROES Act to make sure that Congress is acting to help people get connected and afford their internet service during this crisis. Chairman Pai, let me ask you, will you commit to move quickly to implement the emergency broadband benefit title in the HEROES Act, if enacted, so that it will help ensure Americans can pay for their internet service bills during this crisis?
Yes, Chairman Doyle, the Commission will implement any legislation enacted by Congress, and I draw on the action we took in response to your leadership on the COVID-19 telehealth program. We stood that up very quickly, and we will always take our instructions from Congress very seriously.
Thank you, Chairman. Zach?
As a reminder to members, you can press *3 to enter the question queue. I will now recognize Ranking Member Latta. Ranking Member Latta, your line is live.
Well, thank you again, and I thank my friend, the chairman, for today's call again. And Chairman Pai, again, I want to thank you very much for the attention that you've shown to our districts around the country, and also before the pandemic started, your visit again to my district for a second time, and really appreciate it. And you know firsthand that hospitals and healthcare providers in my district are utilizing telehealth and want to continue expanding access. However, the broadband availability limits their reach. The FCC has done a great job recognizing the importance of this technology and supporting telehealth efforts, especially in rural areas. Would you tell us about the implementation of your 2 telehealth programs and how you plan to tie broadband access more broadly into the telehealth strategy? And are there any gaps in these programs that need to be addressed by Congress? Again, thanks very much.
Thank you, Congressman Latta. In addition to your hospitality when we last had the chance to visit. So the 2 different programs are, number one, the COVID-19 telehealth program and the rural healthcare program. With respect to the COVID-19 telehealth program, in less than 3 weeks after Congress passed the CARES Act, we adopted rules for our COVID-19 telehealth program. We created the application process. We opened up the application window. We approved the first set of funding requests, and that process continues. Unsurprisingly, there's tremendous interest in and demand for COVID-19 telehealth program funding for connected care services across the country. We've seen it from urban districts and rural ones alike. We've already approved 6 sets of funding requests since April 13th. We've now supported 82 healthcare providers in 30 states for a total of $33 million of the program's $200 million authorized by the CARES Act having been dispersed. And one of the grantees, I would add, is Health Partners of Western Ohio, which is based in Lima, which has gotten $737,098 to deploy telemedicine carts to about 50 or so locations around the state, expanding access to care for low-income patients. So we're really excited about how the COVID-19 telehealth program has helped us realize in this unfortunate time one of the promises of telehealth, connecting healthcare providers with patients in a safe way. Additionally, we've taken action on the rural healthcare program front, the longstanding FCC program to promote telehealth. That too has a role to play in addressing the pandemic, and here we've taken a number of steps to help meet connectivity needs. For example, the Commission unanimously adopted my proposal that I introduced in February to fully fund all eligible rural healthcare program services for the current funding year with an additional $42 million in funding. In addition to that, in March, we extended the application window until June 30th of this year, And we also waived the gift rule governing the rural healthcare program until September 30th of 2020, all of which is because we understand that we need to enable service providers to offer and hospitals to solicit and accept improved connections or additional equipment for telemedicine during the coronavirus outbreak. And so our hope is that between these two programs, we'll help ensure that healthcare providers around the country have the resources and flexibility they need to promote telehealth solutions. As for other additional gaps in the programs that need to be addressed, I would, of course, defer to other agencies, but I will say that some of the gaps that I've talked about before beyond the FCC's jurisdiction, like removing or relaxing interstate medical licensure obligations, reimbursement formulas, and the like, are things that need to have a closer look taken. And I really do think this is a moment for telehealth and telemedicine to shine. And let's work together across agencies and across branches of government to make sure that telehealth's promise is realized.
Thank you.
I will now recognize Chairman Pallone. Chairman Pallone, your line is live.
Thank you, Zach. Mike, I didn't hear most of your opening remarks, and so I just wanted to remind members that, that this is open to the press and it's being recorded and is going to be on our website later. I keep forgetting myself during these calls that the press is listening and that this is a public forum, so I just wanted to remind members of that. And then I wanted to say to Chairman Pai, thank you for providing us with information about how exactly different providers are trying to meet your voluntary pledge. We've actually been giving out to members on the Democratic side and talking to individual members about, which providers are doing what in terms of agreeing not to shut off, agreeing what, when they're going to, give low priced or free services for connection. That information has been very helpful. Not only that you're doing the volunteer program, but that, who's doing it so that we can pass that out. I've passed that out quite a bit to different Democratic members. And then I also wanted to say, with regard to Bob's question about about telehealth and your response, Chairman, we've really been trying to get through a lot of these regulatory pitfalls in each set of legislation. We've tried to do more to expand telehealth. So if when I hear what you said or any other ideas from members bipartisan about how to continue to get rid of some of these regulations and others that make it more difficult to do telemedicine, please keep informing us of that. I know I've spoken quite a bit. I wanted to ask a question about the E-rate program, Chairman. In other words, with the E-rate program, that we have this persistence of the digital divide, a lot of kids being locked out of the digital classroom during this pandemic, and I know that the FCC is concerned about this, but I don't know exactly what you can do as opposed to what we need for legislation. So in the HEROES Act, we tried to enable, we not only increase the amount of funding for the E-rate program considerably, but we tried to change the authorizing language to so students can first of all, so that the E-rate program could be used for two things: given, basically hand out corrective devices, computers or laptops to kids, and then fund broadband connections themselves. Those are the two changes in the authorization, plus the additional money, which I think is like authorized at $5 billion and appropriated at 1.5. But now, my understanding, Chairman, is that right now E-rate is used primarily to put together connections to schools themselves, not to the students, or not to give out students connective devices. And what I wanted to know is, can you do more without the legislation? Because, the HEROES Act has only passed the House. In other words, can you do more than just connect the schools? Could you actually do connections to the kids, or give the kids connected devices like computers? Is the reason you're not doing that because authorization, or do you think you have the flexibility to do that now? I'm just trying to see to what extent what we have in the HEROES Act is necessary, or could you do it without the HEROES Act? That's my question, if you can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chairman Pallone, for focusing on that. And I want to extend our commitment to working with you and your staff on this. As you might know, a couple of months ago, as the CARES Act was being developed, our team got in touch with Congress to encourage the construction of what we called a remote learning initiative, essentially allowing a streamlined program similar to what Congress ultimately did on the telehealth side to enable students to get connected. And that's something that's of firsthand importance to me. I've got 2 school-age kids now who are home doing remote learning, and so I understand keenly the importance of that. The problem we face under current law, Mr. Chairman, is that the law restricts E-rate, the FCC's support through the E-rate program to services delivered to classrooms, very specific terms. And so devices can't be supported, and services outside of the classroom can't be supported. Obviously, we are in a very different environment now with millions of American school kids trying to learn from home, and that's why we pitched Congress on this remote learning initiative. Going forward, if Congress implements new legislation to either change the existing statute or to set up a remote learning initiative along the lines we suggested, we would, of course, administer that legislation faithfully to make sure that America's school kids get the connections that they need. And so we very much look forward to working with you on that. In addition, I want to thank you, if I might, for your comments about keeping you and your staff and your constituents informed. If folks on the call want to get more information, they can go to fcc.gov/Keep Americans Connected to get more details about the pledge itself and about some of the other actions the FCC has taken. And connected to that, we've also made a list that the chairman kindly mentioned about a whole bunch of providers, literally from A to Z, that have done specific things like providing free Wi-Fi hotspots to students or increasing minimum speeds with no charge. Many of these companies you probably have never heard of, and that's sort of the point, that we wanted to recognize these companies that are going above and beyond, in many cases, to provide consumers, especially low-income, rural, and other vulnerable consumers, with better and cheaper services during this pandemic. So thank you, Chairman Pallone, for mentioning that too. And you can find that on the FCC's website, the Above and Beyond call.
Thank you.
I will now recognize Ranking Member Walden. Ranking Member Walden, your line is live.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks to Mike and Frank and Bob for putting together this briefing. And Chairman Pai, thank you for your leadership on the commission and your team there for connecting Americans and doing what you're doing. So far, only I think about 25 million of the 200 million that was appropriated has been awarded. Do you intend to spend the full 200 million, and what's that money going to be used for? And do you anticipate that there's 200 million, that 200 million will fulfill the demand? That's question number one. I'll get to question two after that.
Thank you, Ranking Member Walden, for that question. And I know that telehealth is something that you've been concerned about as well, including in your district. So far, we've actually now reached the $33 million mark. We just approved the 6th set of applications, and I do expect that we'll be making additional awards in the next day or two. I've been looking over the 7th round as we speak. We're processing applications as quickly as we can while still doing the necessary due diligence to protect against any possible waste, fraud, and abuse. And because this is a new program, of course, with new applicants, our staff has had to spend considerable time working with applicants to ensure, number one, that the applicant is eligible for the program, and number two, that they are seeking eligible services and devices. For example, they can't request funding for a chair or something like that, something that has nothing to do with telehealth. And third, that they are complying with all other program rules and are otherwise agreeing to the FCC's rules on auditing and the like. So we want to make sure at the front end we do as much work as we can on that type of evaluation as quickly as possible, and then we get that money quickly into the hands of healthcare facilities that are dealing with the pandemic. Now, we do anticipate that we'll spend the full $200 million. It's, of course, too early to say with certainty whether the demand will exceed $200 million, but given the incredible response that we've gotten, and I've heard personally from healthcare facilities across the country about how interested they are in participating or how glad they were awarded funding, that we will see a tremendous amount of interest. And so far, in terms of the uses which you asked about, we're seeing a wide variety of sources and devices being procured. NYU, for example, Langone Health in New York City is getting almost $1 million to expand its telemedicine footprint to operating rooms and conference rooms that have been converted into ICUs. And this gives some of those providers who are doing heroic work in New York City the ability to remotely monitor patients in those rooms. We've also seen some who specialize in mental health treatment engaging in telemedicine because they are worried about the effects of isolation, of course, and their patients can't come into a bricks and mortar facility to get treatment. That's been very helpful as well. And in addition, there's a video that was put out, I just saw this last week, from a transplant doctor at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and I had a chance to take a look at it. It's incredible. It's a very young child who just got a transplant, and the doctor is handing his mother a device saying, "This device will now help us keep track of your son when you go home so you don't have to come back and risk exposure to the coronavirus pandemic." And it's thanks in part to a grant from the FCC. And so I want to thank all of you in Congress for helping us make that happen. Obviously, the healthcare providers are the first line of defense, but without your leadership on this issue, we would not be able to make the progress that we've made. And so look forward to many more of those stories being told and your hard work being recognized by patients and just the American public generally in the time to come.
Well, thanks. The second question I have relates to the Broadband Data Act and I think our bipartisan mission to update the maps so the decisions that are made to spend money more closely fill in the digital divide. But we all know that's going to take a while to get there. Are there steps you're taking now ahead of receiving the funding for that to improve broadband data collection? And if so, can you talk about those? And again, thanks for being on the call.
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Walden. So I agree with you that using updated and accurate broadband deployment data is critical to bridging the digital divide. And that's why in August of 2019, the FCC adopted the Digital Opportunity Data Collection Report and Order, which is aimed at generating more granular and more precise broadband maps through the creation of this, what we call the DODC. Now, the Broadband Data Act, which of course was passed this past March, affirms that approach and it directs us to collect more accurate data, and I completely endorse that general approach. I can tell you that staff at the FCC are hard at work on the rulemaking to implement the Broadband Data Act, notwithstanding the COVID pandemic, and I've personally spoken to the Wireline Competition Bureau staff that are responsible for this. Among other things, they're determining what particular changes are needed to the rules that we adopted last August to make this digital opportunity data collection a reality. I hope to circulate a notice of proposed rulemaking in the near term to ensure that we meet the statutory deadline that is in that act, and we will keep you posted on that front. In addition to that, adopting new rules is, of course, only one part of the equation. The Commission also plans to rely on the Universal Service Administrative Company to implement the IT infrastructure and auditing needed for our new maps, but that Broadband Data Act has prohibited us from relying on USAC for that and didn't appropriate new funds to move forward with that data collection. So we hope to work with you, all of you, in the time to come on that particular issue.
I will now recognize Representative McNerney. Representative McNerney, your line is live.
Well, good morning and thank you. I want to thank Chairman Doyle for holding this forum. These issues are very important to my district. So Chairman Pai, I was pleased to see the pledge that you announced. I, along with many committee colleagues, had also written the letters to the major communications provider, urging them to take steps to keep Americans connected during the crisis. So my questions are about the effectiveness of the pledge. First, how many complaints have the FCC received to date regarding providers not honoring commitments made under the Keep America's Connected Pledge or other COVID-19 related commitments? And what steps is the Commission taking to encourage providers to meet those commitments when there's been a complaint?
Thank you for the question, Congressman, and for your leadership, along with that of your colleagues, in contacting the providers as well to reinforce this public-private partnership and Keep Americans Connected pledge. We have received approximately 2,200 COVID-19 related complaints, and about 1,400 of those have received a response from the carrier to date. Under our process, as you may know, informal complaints that we receive are served on the relevant company, and then consumers receive a response within 30 days. Now, of those 2,200, approximately 500 involved a complaint specifically about the pledge. The other COVID-19 complaints involved questions about billing or network issues or broadband access generally. Now, it's my understanding that most of the complaints that we have received about the pledge have been resolved to ensure that the consumer remains connected during the pandemic. In addition to that, I wanted to let you know that I have been holding calls with not just some of the larger companies that have been that have taken the pledge, but also the trade associations that represent them, and have repeatedly reinforced the importance of maintaining consumer connectivity during this time. And that's part of the reason why, as I believe I mentioned in my opening remarks, that we extended that pledge to the end of June, because we recognize that a lot of consumers are still experiencing disruptions because of this pandemic, and they need connectivity for all the things they do in their daily lives. But thank you for the question, sir.
I will now recognize Representative Shimkus. Representative Shimkus, your line is live.
Thank you, Zach, and Chairman, thanks for being with us today. Just a quick question. You answered a few of them, and I was going to go down the Walden route on the money, and you answered that there. I do have some great letters from a mental health provider who's actually seeing really better response through telehealth than when people have to go in, and it was really an interesting 2-page letter, and just for him to tell the stories about how they think they're reaching people better through telehealth in that, at least in this one case. The question has to deal with 5G. You probably thought this would probably be coming. I followed the Light Square debate years ago. You guys did a great job, I think, creating an approval which created guard bands, a cutoff switch, and power issues. 5G is going to be the only way some of my folks are going to get real connectivity in some of these rural areas. And I want to encourage you to keep working on that, and I'm just going to pledge to work what I can do with the House to encourage us not to follow the Senate's route on the NDA.
Well, thank you so much for that, Congressman. We believe that America needs to lead in 5G, and that requires us to think creatively about a variety of different spectrum bands, and within any given spectrum band to focus on the engineering analysis that enables us to balance competing interests. And that's exactly what we did in the case of the L-band. We took a very careful look over many, many years, and we applied strict conditions to the licensee to ensure that they would be able to pursue 5G and IoT type applications and services while protecting incumbents in other bands, particularly GPS, from harmful interference. And those strict conditions are outlined in our 74-page order with about 440-some footnotes. And I can assure you that it's very sound in terms of the engineering. And I also want to express my appreciation for your statement, which I just happened to see before the teleconference began. I understand with your military background, you've got a very interesting vantage point on these issues, and I just want to thank you for your leadership and support on this issue.
I will now recognize Representative Clark. Representative Clark, your line is live.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator, and let me thank the Chairman, Doyle and Pallone, as well as our ranking members, Latta and Walden, for convening this subcommittee briefing today on the FCC's response to COVID-19 as we fight to address this pandemic. And thank you to you, Chairman Pai, for joining us. Chairman Pai, as you know, I represent one of the hardest hit areas in the nation, that's Brooklyn, New York. My constituents know that access to broadband is a necessity, a lifeline in 2020. This pandemic has demonstrated that fact 10 times over. We're now using broadband to get Americans remotely back to work, continuing to educate our youth by digital learning and providing adequate health care services for our most vulnerable communities. Broadband is indeed an essential utility. And recently, the FCC extended the Keep Americans Connected pledge through June 30th. And that is nice to hear given the current situation. However, America will not be the same as it once was pre-COVID-19. And I can tell you that here in New York, where we would be having summer school. That June 30th deadline, it's almost we're unable to say that that pledge would not need to be extended. We recognize that the temporary pledge won't address long-lasting impact of this virus. It will take a robust plan to safeguard and strengthen our country as we continue to be resilient in a time of crisis. So, Chairman Pai, let me just ask, what actions will you take as FCC chairman to ensure that vulnerable communities in hotspot areas like Brooklyn will not continue to feel the brunt of this pandemic? And will you commit today to ensure that low-income consumers will have access to affordable broadband as stated in the Keep Americans Connected pledge?
Well, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. And before I formally answer, it goes without saying, but I do want to express my deep sympathy to your constituents who, as you mentioned, have been among the hardest hit in the nation. Certainly hope that they stay safe and that you and your staff stay safe as well. From our part, we are committed to ensuring that your constituents, every American, stay connected with the broadband and telephone connectivity during this outbreak. And that's part of the reason why over 2 months ago, we set up the Keep Americans Connected pledge. And as I mentioned earlier on the call, on April 30th, we announced an extension of that pledge because, of course, in places like Brooklyn, the pandemic is still an ongoing issue, and connectivity is still very, very important to consumers. The companies representing the vast majority of broadband and telephone subscribers, including in your district, have already agreed to this extension, and many of them have gone above and beyond the commitments. They've created new programs that offer free or low-cost internet access. They've expanded their existing low-income programs. They've set up Wi-Fi hotspots, which are very useful, of course, in areas where the connectivity may otherwise not be there. And so we're going to keep emphasizing the importance of that pledge and ensuring that companies understand the importance that you and others on Capitol Hill attach to this issue. I also want to note that we've taken many other actions beyond the pledge that bear on the question that you've touched on, which is how do we make sure that low-income consumers stay connected? With respect to the Lifeline program, for example, I proactively directed our staff to do a number of things. For example, relaxing some of the re-enrollment and decertification rules. These are essentially rules that both on the consumer side and on the company side, the Lifeline provider side, require essentially administrative hoops to be jumped through in order to continue service. And we wanted to make sure that that kind of hoop or paperwork didn't stand in the way of consumer maintaining service, so we've relaxed those. In addition, one of the things that occurred to me was you have a lot of people, and perhaps in your district too, who have recently lost jobs and that may need to apply to the Lifeline program to get the benefits that they need for connectivity. The problem is that under the existing rules, the FCC required a consumer to submit 3 months worth of income information to demonstrate their eligibility. Well, a lot of folks, of course, have just been newly unemployed. They don't have 3 months to verify that they've been unemployed. So we relaxed that rule as well to simply say that they need to submit 1 month of information in order to qualify. And that's just in the Lifeline program, as I mentioned. We've taken a bunch of other steps in terms of STAs to make sure that wireless companies are able to ramp up wireless service to people who are staying at home and using mobile devices. We've increased funding in our healthcare program substantially, both the COVID-19 telehealth program, which has directed a large amount of money to a number of providers in New York City and the surrounding areas, as well as the other programs that we've got, E-rate program, for example, relaxing the gift rules, which I mentioned earlier. All of which to say that rest assured that we're pulling out the stops and making sure that the connectivity is going to be there for folks in Brooklyn who now more than ever need that digital connection in order to conduct their daily lives.
I will now recognize Representative Bilirakis. Representative Bilirakis, your line is live.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
sir. Can you hear me? Okay, you hear? Okay, good. Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Chairman Ladd. I appreciate it very much. And Mr. Chairman Doyle, we're still in first place. I don't know if it's an inside joke. All right. I want to thank, of course, Chairman Pai and the Commission for organizing the voluntary Internet telephone service provider.
You just kind of got into it a little bit about the Lifeline program. We didn't talk about much in.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, let me just go ahead and ask the question. Quickly approaching is hurricane season, with the first tropical storm already approaching the Atlantic coast, and hopefully it'll head out to sea this evening. But in light of the use of resource and staffing changes related to the pandemic, of course, what is our readiness for dealing with a hurricane and its aftermath from a telecommunications standpoint at this time? I know this is, Floridians are concerned, but most people are, particularly on the East Coast. So if you could answer that, I'd appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Sure thing, Congressman. Happy to do so. From our perspective, at least, we continue to operate effectively during this national emergency, even as usage increases dramatically. And part of the reason for that is because broadband infrastructure investment has increased in years. And we've also been very responsive in the wake of some of the hurricanes and other natural disasters that we've seen, including Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Irma, all of which touched Florida or areas near there. And so the other thing that has developed is that over the last 3 years, we have generally, and I've personally made many contacts with some of our sister agencies, with FEMA, with DHS, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and with other agencies. And I've also traveled to different parts of the country, from Puerto Rico to Louisiana, to meet with state and local officials about some of these issues. And so whenever an emergency strikes, or maybe close to striking, I think we have a sort of policy infrastructure in place, if you will, that enables us to take action in concert with the private sector, pre-positioning assets and the like, and to take action during and after the emergency to ensure that communications infrastructure is going to be there. That's not to say that there aren't still challenges. There's always more we can do to improve public safety, but I can tell you that on a government level, we've done a lot over the last 3 years to ensure that infrastructure will be reliable. I also want to flag that we coordinate weekly with industry, literally every week, to determine their preparedness actions and their needs, as well as to get a firsthand report of network performance and potential challenges to service provision. And our team is continuing to monitor communications network performance to determine availability and resilience. The other thing, since it's actually quite a timely question, the Commission is going to be conducting its yearly exercise of DIRS, which is the Disaster Information Reporting System, on June 2nd and June 3rd. And this is an important exercise. It helps us ensure that companies are prepared to report to the Commission on the status of communications infrastructure during disasters such as hurricanes. And so we look forward to the lessons that we might learn from that exercise. And knock on wood, we do hope, of course, for a quiet hurricane season, because I know it affects folks in your area disproportionately. Finally, I'm not sure exactly what the reference was to being in first, but to the extent you were talking about Tampa Bay successfully recruiting Tom Brady from Patriots Nation, I want to congratulate you on that, and congratulate you in advance on a second-place finish in the AFC Championship to the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. Actually, it's an NFC team, I should say. So look forward to meeting them in the Super Bowl.
I will now recognize Representative Loebsack. Representative Loebsack, your line is live.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be on this meeting, and I really appreciate Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta putting this together. They worked so hard on these issues, as just about everybody on the subcommittee has, since I've been on the subcommittee. And I want to thank Representative Latta in particular for working with me on the Broadband Data Act. And as you mentioned, Chairman Pai, and thank you for being here today. You mentioned that was passed earlier this year on really it was an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote. Both chambers were much behind it. I do want to say also that listening to my friend Yvette Clark, it's interesting, while she may be in the middle of New York City and I may be in the middle of Iowa, we have very, very much the same issues when it comes to broadband, when it comes to communications. An older person, for example, who now might be confined to her apartment in New York City and could get out in the past perhaps to see a provider, has exactly the same problems now that an older person who lives very far away from a provider in Iowa has always had. So when it comes to telehealth and any number of other things, and certainly education, we are all in this together. And I think that's what's important to remember. And I think we've got sort of new impetus and momentum behind the push to continue on the broadband front. And I really only have one question for you at this point. Chairman Pai, you mentioned the Broadband Data Act and the notice of proposed rulemaking regarding implementation of that. If I could just follow up on that, why has the FCC not proposed to move forward using updated data as required by the Broadband Data Act, specifically with respect to the 5G auction item? And that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question and for your leadership on the Broadband Data Act, along with that of Congressman Latta. And I think you put your finger on the issue very well in talking about the importance of broadband, whether you're in Congresswoman Clark's district or your own, urban or rural. This is a critical issue, and that's why I've consistently called it digital opportunity, because I think it captures well the importance for every American of having access to the internet and other advanced technologies. So with respect to the Broadband Data Act and the 5G fund auction item, we have left it open for comment on both options. Option A, of course, moving ahead with a shorter term auction based on the need to get 5G into unserved parts of the country, including rural areas, or option B, using the broadband data as updated through the digital opportunity data collection, and then holding the auction at a later date. And that's part of the reason why we're opening up that conversation. We didn't propose either course. We simply laid out the options for the public to comment on. And just simply to reiterate with respect to the Broadband Data Act, you noted that notice of proposed rulemaking in the near term that we will be looking to issue in order to ensure that we meet the statutory deadline here. The other piece of it, of course, is the funding piece of it. And so one of the things we would like to work with you and Congressman Latta and any other interested members of Congress on is giving us the necessary funding to make that broadband data mapping come to fruition. There's a lot of course, complicated back-end work that needs to happen, and we'd love to be able to get the resources to make that a reality sooner rather than later.
I will now recognize Representative Johnson. Representative Johnson, your line is live.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta for putting this on. Mr. Chairman, you and I have talked about it many times. I'm the poster child in my district for the urban-rural divide. It is devastating what's happened here in Appalachia, Ohio, as it relates to broadband access for distance learning, for telehealth, you name it. I was really pleased to hear that you're planning to vote on June 9th on the final procedures for RDOF, and with the auction still set for October. As you know, and we've communicated this to your office, we've seen that some carriers are mounting challenge to a considerable number of the census blocks on the preliminary list of eligible areas identified by the FCC for RDOF funding. What steps is the FCC taking to verify the census blocks that carriers are claiming to already serve are in fact receiving broadband services that meet FCC standards? For example, I saw one carrier's challenge, and they claim to be providing service of 10-1, 10 megabits download, 1 megabit upload. Anybody knows that is substandard service and will not allow a user to utilize many of the current services and tools that the modern internet provides. So I'm really concerned that some of these challenges might very well be bogus.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And my thinking on this has been informed in part by the visit that you and I did earlier this year. In fact, one of the last trips I took outside of Washington before the pandemic hit. And as you remember, when we were visiting in rural Athens County, I think it was, in Tillowave, fixed wireless company out in a rural area in your district. They just got frustrated by the lack of available broadband, and they built some of that infrastructure themselves. And so I think that it speaks to the fact that many Americans who know they don't have broadband strongly desire it. And that's part of the reason why we set up the RDOF the way we have, a phase one targeting those unserved parts of the country. And just for your information, if you haven't seen it already, the FCC has put out a list of tentatively eligible areas. And your district is one of the biggest winners from RDOF phase one, that is unserved parts of the country. So that's going to be really important in terms of getting phase one up and running, and looking forward to that June 9th vote as well to set up those final auction procedures. The other piece of it involves the challenges, of course, as you mentioned. And here we released in March the preliminary list of census blocks and a map of areas that have been deemed initially eligible for that phase one auction. What I can tell you is the commission staff is carefully reviewing comments that they've received that identifying areas for exclusion or inclusion in that phase one auction, and they will release a final list of eligible blocks prior to the short form application deadline. I am aware, of course, that concerns have been raised about some of the challenges that we've received, and want to assure you and others who might be interested in this issue that staff is doing due diligence to resolve them appropriately. The bottom line is I certainly do not want unserved areas to be taken out of the auction because of inaccurate challenges. That is, areas that are in fact unserved not being eligible for phase one. So that's why we're taking this challenge process seriously. And we look forward to working with you in your office to make sure that your district and other districts with a lot of unserved locations are able to be robust participants in phase one of the auction. Oh, and by the way, the other thing I should have mentioned is if an incumbent provider is only providing 10.1 service, that's not a valid challenge. All of which is to say that it's 25 megabits per second or above is what we're trying to focus on here in terms of connectivity.
I will now recognize Representative O'Halloran. Representative O'Halloran, your line is live.
Thank you, Zach. And I want to thank Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta for putting this on and all the hard work they've been doing over the past several months. Chairman Pai, thank you also for all the work that you and your employees have been doing and staff. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed a premium on connectivity and demonstrated how broadband is essential for daily life. But thousands of my constituents in rural and tribal communities have been failed by the Commission's broadband maps, which must not happen again. We have terrible problems up on Navajo and White Mountain Apache. Both have undergone a tremendous amount of heartbreak through this process of the vaccine. I mean, not the vaccine. While I appreciate the 5G and rural America's recognition of the need for the targeted wireless broadband support to tribal lands, I'm very concerned about the accuracy of the underlying coverage data the Commission intends to use under an expedited option A and a delay in serving rural America under option B. This $9 billion proceeding is simply too important to be done incorrectly. My question is, given the disadvantages COVID-19 has placed on those on the wrong side of the digital divide, why hasn't the FCC moved more quickly to comply with the Broadband Data Act's mandates in order to maximize the impact of scarce federal funds allocated for this proceeding? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. What I can tell you is that we are focused on this particular issue. As I mentioned earlier, the FCC staff has been working on a draft notice of proposed rulemaking, which we hope to issue over the next several months to ensure that we are able to meet that deadline that is set in the statute. More generally, one of the issues, though, that we need to work with Congress on is the funding to be able to do the actual mapping work itself. And here, of course, we've flagged for Congress that we don't have the necessary funding to be able to do some of that mapping. We also can't rely on the Universal Service Administrative Company to do that, given the statutory prohibition. And so we very much want to work with you on that. The other thing I just wanted to mention, by the way, is that we recognize that tribal nations and other similar communities across the country, Alaska Native communities and others, face unique challenges. Of course, the digital divide is most pronounced there, and in the last visit I did to the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, I saw that for myself. And that's part of the reason why we've been trying to think about different programs we can use to enable tribal members to get vendor connectivity. For example, one of the biggest, if not the biggest grant in the COVID-19 telehealth program that we set up recently, thanks to your leadership in Congress, was to the Navajo Nation. Over $900,000 to get connected care solutions to tribal members who otherwise might have to drive a very long distance to get care. Similarly, we issued a special temporary authority to tribal entities to use unassigned spectrum to provide connectivity, wireless connectivity, in a way that I know the Havasu Pai tribe in Arizona has done a very innovative solution on. So I want to assure you that on all of these different issues, even though they might not specifically be related to the Broadband Data Act, we are doing everything we can to make sure that tribal members get connectivity during this challenging time.
As a reminder to everyone, please just mute your line if you are not speaking. I will now recognize Representative Brooks. Representative Brooks, your line is live.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta. It's very helpful to have briefings like this, and thanks, Chairman Pai, for spending time with us. I want to echo almost all of my colleagues what they've been talking about and the importance of the issues that your commission works on and is leading, and want to commend you for how fast all of the folks at the FCC are trying to work on all of these issues. I'm going to go back to the rural issues in some ways, and what plans or requirements does the FCC have to ensure that both the rural rip and replace efforts, you actually mentioned that some rural providers have really been focused on that as well, but the rip and replace efforts, as well as the new network rollouts with future spectrum auctions that you've mentioned, what requirements or plans do the U.S. networks adopt, that they adopt an open architecture that enables U.S. vendors to play a more significant role in our network rollout? Something that I think we're all continuing to be very concerned about in making sure that our U.S. networks are, have U.S. vendors and have a focus on that rather than maybe outside vendors that might want to do our networks harm.
Well, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And this is an important priority for the Commission, has been well before the pandemic. Two different aspects to the answer. One is looking back, what is in our networks now. And number two is looking ahead, what will be in the networks of the future. With respect to looking back, with the recent signing of the Secure and Trusted Communications Act, the law now ratifies the FCC's recently adopted initiative to help small rural telecommunications companies end their reliance on manufacturers that pose national security threats. As you know, the FCC already has voted unanimously back in November of last year to ban suspect technology from networks. And we came up with a list of technology vendors that were deemed to present an unacceptable risk, in particular Huawei and ZTE. And we also came up with a framework for compensating carriers for ripping and replacing that technology. We've also asked them to essentially inventory what equipment is in their networks currently. And I do hope that Congress will build on that success and move forward to quickly appropriate the necessary funding to reimburse carriers for replacing any network equipment or services that have been deemed to present a national security threat. This funding is just essential to successfully transition communications networks, and especially those in small and rural areas, so small carriers in rural areas, to infrastructure provided by more trusted vendors. Now, with respect to the going forward piece, this is something we've been thinking about a lot, and one of the unfortunate side effects of the pandemic was that we had to postpone a March 26th forum on Open Radio Access Network Architecture, or ORAN, that we were planning to host at the FCC, and we'd already invited a wide variety of vendors and experts to come share their views on what the network architecture of the future would look like. And one of the things I can tell you is that we are actively still engaged in conversations with other government agencies and with the private sector to ensure that we have a fully informed conversation about how we transition from where we are now, which is a more hardware-focused, full-stack approach, to one in which the networks will be more blended. You will see more hardware. You will see hardware, of course, in the future, but you'll also see more software-defined solutions to essentially virtualize some of the 5G network architecture, especially as it involves management and operation of these networks. And the advantage to that is not just in terms of security and cost effectiveness, it's also, as you implied in your question, that many of these companies are based in the United States. There are small companies that are really doing innovative work here in the U.S., and we want to make sure that as we move forward, we allow them to have a space for innovation and investment, just as much as the incumbent equipment providers. So it's going to be a very important conversation to come. That conversation will include all of you. As I mentioned, we want to make sure that we're all moving ahead with one voice and reinforcing the importance of security of these 5G networks going forward.
I will now recognize Representative Soto. Representative Soto, your line is live.
Thank you so much, Chairman Pai, for being on the line. We obviously are all seeing how important our telecommunications really is. And my concern is about domestic production of telecom infrastructure. As we see the highlight this crisis and the growing importance of the supply chain security and domestic production, what can we all work together on to encourage more domestic production of telecom equipment again going forward?
That's a good question, Congressman. And as I was just mentioning, this is an important and increasing issue, especially as 5G networks of the future will involve not just the typical communication services that we rely on, talking or accessing the internet over a smartphone, will also drive entire industries like transportation and healthcare and education and manufacturing. And so to the extent that those 5G networks include vulnerabilities, we ultimately are opening up wide sectors of our economy to vulnerabilities, and we certainly don't want to do that. We want to mitigate the risks as much as possible. And that's one of the reasons why, with respect to domestic production, we've been focused on two things, I would say. Number one is in the context of our so-called rip and replace proposal, ensuring that U.S. telecom carriers cannot use universal service funds from the FCC on untrustworthy equipment coming from abroad, but also they are encouraged to think about ensuring the security of their networks going forward. And look forward to working with you and others in Congress to provide the appropriate funding for them to be able to make not just a financially wise, but also a security-wise decision on that. Secondly, as I mentioned, we've been looking very actively at so-called open radio access networks or virtual radio access network solutions. Many of these companies, again, are based here in the United States, and although we don't directly fund them, nor do we require particular carriers to use them, we do want to open a conversation with the private sector and other public sector agencies on encouraging companies to think more broadly about the universe of solutions for network architecture. That's one of the ways to ensure that not only will our networks be comprised of more cost-effective solutions, typically software is less expensive than hardware, and typically it can be more secure in many ways, but also that we are enabling some of these American-based companies to thrive. And we do hope to restart that FCC forum on virtual radio access network issues when we can, when it's safe to do so. But in the meantime, we'll continue the conversation with you and with others who are interested.
I will now recognize Representative Gianforte. Representative Gianforte, your line is live.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Alata, and Chairman Pai, thanks for being with us. I want to add my voice to the chorus about rural access. Montana has a lot of open space, and I'm encouraged by the steps the Commission's been taking to get these people connected, and yet many of my constituents still are lacking access. And I still hop on calls and people are telling me they had to drive into town to get on their Zoom meeting, and they don't have internet access at home, so it's impairing their ability to educate their kids. The coronavirus has just further highlighted this digital divide, and we've been talking about this throughout the call, but I'd love to have, if you would, just summarize the steps you're taking to help expand access in rural America. That would be really helpful to me, Chairman. And again, I appreciate all your work.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Congressman. And the issue I know is keen in Montana. I've been to places like Wisdom and St. Ignatius, and these are towns that are rural, that are remote, and that are hard to get to physically. And even with digital technology, it's sometimes hard to get there too. And that's why we've consistently said that closing the digital divide has been the top priority of the Commission. And I think, if anything, the current pandemic has highlighted the importance of bringing digital opportunity to every American, whether you live in a big city or in a small town. And it's also confirmed the Commission's decision to proceed expeditiously with Phase 1 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Again, this is a $16 billion phase of the RDOF that will go to providing high-speed, high-quality connections to unserved parts of the country. And this will make a big, big difference to many, many rural Americans. We owe it to them to connect them as soon as is feasible, and that's why I'm very committed to moving ahead with that October auction, the first phase of the RDOF. We're estimating, for what it's worth, that as many as 85,000 Montanans will benefit from the $16 billion that the Commission has allocated for Phase 1. That's going to take a big bite out of the digital divide in the state and make a big difference for those consumers. So on the fixed side, at least, we're going to very much committed to the RDOF. More generally, we're committed to making sure that we remove and revise our regulations as necessary to provide the strongest possible business case for companies to expand and to maintain a high-quality network. And I think if you talk to some of the providers serving the rural areas, they'll share some of the stories that they've been able to do more because of the FCC's dispensations for special temporary authority with respect to spectrum, or getting a grant from the FCC's rural healthcare program has enabled them to provide more and better connections to healthcare facilities. Same thing on the E-rate program, that relaxing some of the gift rules enables schools in Montana to solicit and accept connectivity and other types of services from broadband providers. So we've been doing a lot on the rural front, and I understand there's still more to do. Like I said, I've been to your district, and I know from where I'm from too, that's still an issue. But we're going to continue to put our nose to the grindstone and you keep working hard to make sure that folks in Montana and across the country get digital opportunity they deserve.
I will now recognize Representative Eshoo. Representative Eshoo, your line is live.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Doyle, and the bipartisan leadership of our subcommittee, and thank you to you, Chairman Pai. I want to circle back to the COVID-19 telehealth program. The good news is that the FCC has moved quickly to stand it up and to approve the funding requests. The downside is that we hear that there are major problems in getting the money out the door. People don't really, they're not, they don't look at the fine print of legislation. When they know that there is money there that they need, they want it to move quickly. Now, I think you said that $33 million out of the $200 million has already gone out the door. So my question to you is, how long is it going to take for the healthcare providers to actually get their checks, not the commitments, but the actual money through the program? And I think it would be helpful if you could send maybe a monthly or a biweekly report to the chairman and the ranking member so that we can track the money moving out the door. So can you tell us what your backlog is right now, where there are funding requests but the money has not gone out the door, and also about, I think it would be helpful to us to know on a continuing basis, and that you make a commitment to just get a report to us so that we can track it.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And we're as I mentioned, actively working on this program, and we do have the $33 million in funding commitments. Now, in terms of actual disbursements, to receive actual disbursements, eligible healthcare providers that are approved for funding in the program have to submit an invoice and supporting documentation. They have to do, the invoice and the documentation in order to receive reimbursement for eligible expenses and services. And this requirement, of course, is a critical check against any waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. And we've set up a team of commission staff that have been and always stand ready to review and process certified invoices for reimbursement. To date, we've received only one certified invoice from a COVID-19 telehealth program participant. So we will continue to process those as they come in, but that's the current state of play now. And going forward, we'd be happy to have our staff update the committee, or the subcommittee, rather, on the state of play here. And we can continue that conversation with Chairman Doyle and Ranking Member Latta after the call, if it would be helpful. Oh, and by the way, I should have mentioned, we also recognize. Sorry, Zach. I also should have mentioned, in terms of reporting, we report monthly to the Office of Management and Budget as well. So in terms of the time period, I do think the monthly would minimize the burden on our staff, just to flag that for you. Sorry, Zach.
No problem at all. I apologize. I will now recognize Representative Wahlberg. Representative Wahlberg, your line is live.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the chairman and ranking member for holding this, as well as Chairman Pai. Chairman, so appreciated the time you spent in my district, seeing the development of the rural broadband that finally was coming to parts of my district that hadn't had any for what we could see for the long foreseeable future, but actually took place. And I can tell you from actual experience, one who has almost every hearing that we've had talking about broadband or anything close to it, brought up the fact that I was not a recipient of the benefits of rural broadband myself or any other capability of using the internet, et cetera, in a modern way. But not long after you and I were watching the development and the implementation of rural broadband cables at various parts of my district, I got to admit, I have it now, and had we not had this, I don't know how I would have carried on during this pandemic thus far with all of the Zoom meetings and everything else. So I'm a proponent of rural broadband, and probably now not backing off on it in any way, shape, or form, of pushing that we can see this all across the country. So thank you for your efforts. Let me ask this one question relative to the use of our digital capabilities this coming school year. Specifically, think we've talked about K-12 primarily, but I'm thinking about the numerous independent colleges and universities, as well as large universities like Michigan State. But the independent college universities in my district, like Albion, Adrian, Siena Heights University, Hillsdale College, and the rest, some of them have not made up their mind yet whether they're going to have on-campus classes this coming year, at least to start. Are we feeling comfortable that with the potential of having not simply businesses, individual consumers, but also colleges and universities ramping up and using solely online capabilities, digital capabilities for their students, for classes? How are we looking at that? Are we prepared?
That's a great question, Congressman. And first, I want to thank you for your hospitality in the district. I've learned a lot from you and your constituents during that visit. Nothing I learned greater than the importance of broadband to folks in Michigan, as we saw along that highway where fiber was being strung in real time. What a big difference that made. And that's going to continue to be the case. And I think you've identified one of the issues that we're struggling with is for those educational institutions and other anchor institutions that may have had their regular routine disrupted. What happens, for example, in the fall if we need to rely on high-speed connectivity in order for them to fulfill their mission? And I think the good news is that over the last 6 weeks, or 8 weeks rather, we've seen a dramatic spike in the usage of these networks. So there's been an estimate, for example, that on the fixed side, we've seen usage go up something like 20 to 35%. a tick less than that, perhaps 10 to 25% on the wireless side, but that the network architecture for broadband in the United States has been exceptionally strong. It's been constructed to withstand an even higher peak than that. All of which is to say that if we emerge into an environment where millions of college students were now learning online, I am confident that they would be able to have the connectivity they need in order to learn and to submit papers and homework and the like. That's something, of course, we'll continue to monitor, and we'll continue to collaborate with others, including the Department of Education, where we've already done some outreach in terms of ensuring connectivity for educational institutions. But the short answer is that we want to do everything we can within the current law and to work with Congress if the law should change to ensure that educational institutions and students have that digital connectivity. It's going to be really important, not just K through 12, as you mentioned, but also for universities too.
We currently have 2 callers left in the queue. I will now recognize Representative Cardenas. Representative Cardenas, your line is live.
Thank you, Chairman and ranking members, for having this hearing, and appreciate it, Chairman Pai, the opportunity for us to dialogue in front of the somewhat full view of the people of America and the press. My question has to do with the fact that we have currently one of the highest numbers of, if not the highest numbers of Americans, millions of Americans out of work, and the highest unemployment rate in the last 70-some to 80 years. And therefore, that fallout of COVID-19 has hit economically and the health and well-being of Americans. Now, we're all going to recover from this. Unfortunately, even though not a member of Congress has to worry about connectivity to the degree that our unemployed millions of Americans of households have to deal with that, my question has to do with the Lifeline program, something that did need better progress before this pandemic, but something that certainly I think that the Commission could possibly address, and that is the issue of making data and minutes unlimited for subscribers. So I'm pretty sure you agree that it's good to fortify that and to increase the ability for individuals to be able to use it during these tough times. And one of the things that I want to point out, that as a former small business owner myself, it's important for everybody to understand that this is important for kids to be able to do their homework, for teachers to be able to communicate with children, but also I have a feeling that many of the unemployed Americans that found themselves working for someone else or working for another business are going to find themselves possibly forced to or inspired to head off on their own and start their own little business. And if they're not connected during these difficult times, it's going to be much harder for them to envision that opportunity for them to use these tools for their business or to even have them accessible in their corner of America. So my question once again is, what is the FCC going to be doing, if at all, to make data and minutes unlimited for subscribers on Lifeline? And if you could answer not only whether you agree with that method, but if the Commission is in fact going to embark on that in a future meeting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question, Congressman. And I'll note at the outset that, especially given your small business background, you may appreciate that one of the reasons why we structured the Keep Americans Connected plan we did was to cover not just residential consumers, who are, of course, vital, but also small businesses, because I know that there are a lot of folks who have invested a lot of sweat equity over the years and have small businesses that require connectivity, and we wanted to make sure that they, too, would not be cut off from the connections they need in order to continue to do business and, in some cases, literally keep the lights on. With respect to Lifeline, during this crisis, we have taken aggressive action at the FCC to keep existing Lifeline subscribers connected and to ease burdens on consumers who are seeking to enroll in the program. For example, we've temporarily waived a number of our rules to help ensure that existing Lifeline subscribers can stay connected and aren't removed from the program. And we've also waived the requirement that consumers seeking to qualify for Lifeline based on their income, have to provide at least 3 consecutive months of income documentation. I mean, of course, many Americans have recently lost their jobs. They don't have 3 months of documentation, so we wanted to make sure that that rule didn't stand in the way of them getting the Lifeline connections that they need. And all of these steps we've taken will make it easier for Americans to qualify for and stay in the Lifeline program. Now, with respect to changes such as making data or minutes unlimited, and I would note that the FCC doesn't cap the amount of data or minutes that a Lifeline carrier can offer. We've, of course, encouraged them to go above and beyond, and the Keep Americans Connected pledge, which many of them have signed, dozens of Lifeline companies. But we've also saluted those who have made new or improved low-cost offerings available to low-income consumers. And so, for example, TracFone and QLink and Sprint have been offering increased data and unlimited voice minutes to meet their Lifeline customers' needs during this pandemic. And so I want to thank them and other companies who are thinking proactively about ways to serve Lifeline consumers better. And for our part, we'll continue to look at additional ways that we can help consumers get and stay connected to Lifeline during the COVID pandemic. All those regulatory reforms I talked about at the beginning, we've been proactive in doing a lot of that, and we'll continue to look at ways we can do that, and we'll be happy to work with you on those solutions.
I will now recognize Representative Dingell. Representative Dingell, your line is live.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Pai, and the Chairman of FOL and the subcommittees today. I know everybody's been asking you a lot of questions on other subjects, so I'm going to ask you COVID questions. I've been home and getting a number of myself. How is the FCC addressing the surge in robocalls and scams that use fear of COVID to trick people into giving up sensitive information? And what role is the FCC playing in track and trace measures? I know people's phones are being used to track data. How are we ensuring the privacy of individuals?
Thank you for the questions, Congresswoman. With respect to the first question, which is addressing the robocalls and scams that are COVID related, it is unfortunate that many of these fraudsters have adapted their nefarious business models to take advantage of people's fears. But the Commission has taken several aggressive actions to address this problem. To give you a few examples, first, with the Federal Trade Commission, we sent in early April some letters to so-called gateway providers. These are small telecom providers here in the U.S. that were bringing into the country certain COVID-19 robocall scams through international traffic. And we told them to block these calls or face the prospect of having our nation's top carriers stop carrying any of their traffic. Within 24 hours, they stopped bringing these scam calls into the country. So that was a good solution for American consumers. Additionally, we've created a webpage for consumers to help them identify and avoid these scams, and we've kept it updated with new information as we receive it. And for folks who are interested, it has real voices that were used in these robocalls, and also an example of a scam text that people get. And so we also included on that webpage tips for avoiding any scams, whether it's a phone call or a text. And I personally have been aggressive in publicizing these issues through my official Twitter account and other social media. In addition to that, we have additional ongoing investigations into COVID-19 related scam calls. I unfortunately can't publicly disclose the details of those investigations at this time, but I hope to have some news to announce at the appropriate time. But all of which is to say that we are taking this issue very seriously. And robocalls, of course, are a nuisance at best, a scam at worst, and especially during the pandemic, the last thing that any American consumer should have to worry about is being robbed of his or her money and time because of some of these scam calls and texts. And we're going to make sure that we live up to our consumer protection mission and collaborate with sister agencies on it.
There are currently no members left in the question queue. I will turn the briefing over to Chairman Doyle for any closing remarks.
Well, thank you. Once again, Chairman Pai, I want to thank you for joining us today. Also want to thank my colleague, Ranking Member Latta, for co-hosting this call. Our nation's response to this crisis will leave long-lasting marks on our society, and I fear that we are seeing a widening of the digital divide. It's my hope that we can come together to address these inequities, because this crisis has made clear that broadband is not a luxury. It is a necessity, and the burden is upon us to ensure all Americans are connected. We can't afford to leave anyone behind. Thank you again to all who participated on this call today. I hope everybody will continue to stay safe. Have a great day.